what's the point? What is the point of factoring? So in this last section, we were looking at factoring. Why do we want to factor? Okay, and the reason for why all comes down to this, what's called the zero product property. Zero is a very interesting number, and that no matter what number I start with, if I multiply by zero, it makes it zero. And I can't multiply and get zero unless one of the two numbers is zero. For example, here, if I just have A and B could be any real numbers. If I know A times B is zero, then I know one of the two numbers is zero. Okay, zero is the only number that works that way. Okay, so what the zero product property tells me is if I multiply two numbers, A times B, and get zero, then that tells me either A is zero or B is zero or possibly both, right? Then A is zero or B is zero or both equals zero. Okay. And so we're going to use this zero product property to help us solve quadratic equations, because I can make pretty much any equation equal to zero. I just move everything to one side. Okay, so in this next problem, we want to solve x squared plus 5x equals 6. Does it obviously look like a zero product property? First of all, there's no zeros in it. But I can subtract 6 from both sides. Subtracting 6 from both sides, and now this side becomes a 0. Now this side becomes 0. Awesome, now I have a 0. Okay, but the zero product property doesn't apply because this left side here is not a product. It's not a product. It's not a product. The zero product property only works if I'm multiplying two things and getting 0. Well, this side isn't a product. This is where that factoring comes in. Is not a product, but it can be. But it can be if I factor it. Just needs factored. Okay, so this is where that factoring idea comes in. Okay, so when solving these quadratics, step 1, set equal to 0. Okay, so maybe move everything to one side. Set equal to 0. Step 2. Let's get rid of this. I don't like that equals. Oh. Step 1, dot, dot, set equal to 0. Step 2, factor. Factor it. Okay, so now we want to factor this. So this is where that process comes in that we did the last time. So you might be like, wait, Miss Neal, there's a negative. That's okay. We do it the same way. It's just now we have to introduce a negative idea. Okay, so I'm now going to list the factors of 6. Well, we've got 1 and 6, 2 and 3. But one of these factors could be negative. Well, one of them is going to have to be negative. So I could use negative 1 and 6, or 1 and negative 6. Negative 2 and 3, or 2 and negative 3. But I still need to add them and get 5. So negative, oh geez, did we find it the very first? Negative 1 plus 6 is 5. Now you might be like, well, how do I know it's negative 1 and 6 and not 1 and negative 6? Well, when I add these, I get negative 5. And this number here is not negative, it's positive. Okay, so it's important to note, like I can rewrite this as plus and negative 6 there. Okay, so for me to get a positive 5, I need to use negative 1 and 6. So this is going to factor into x. And I always like to start my factors like x and x. X, negative 1 minus 1, x positive 6 plus 6. Now it's always good to check it. If I distribute this out, I get x squared. Maybe we'll do that off to the side over here. X squared plus 6x plus a negative 1x plus a negative 6. So those in the middle do, in fact, I'm left with x squared plus 5x minus 6. So check, it does work. Okay, so we factor it. Okay, now that we have it factored, step 3, set each factor equal to 0. Now here is where we use this zero product property. I am multiplying two things. I am multiplying x minus 1 and x plus 6, and I am equaling 0. Okay, because again, we're just taking this guy, and now we just rewrote this left side into x minus 1, x plus 6 equals 0. Well, I'm multiplying two things. If I'm multiplying two things and getting 0, that tells me that one of the two things has to be 0. So we're going to set each of these factors equal to 0. So I'll say, hey, x minus 1 has to be 0, or x plus 6 equals 0. Okay, well, if x minus 1 equals 0, then if I add 1 to both sides, x equals 1. If x plus 6 equals 0, if I subtract 6 from both sides, x equals negative 6. Sorry, I didn't leave enough room for this problem. So this tells me that x could either be 1 or negative 6. Okay. Those are the two possibilities for x. Then I always like to go back into the very original equation and plug those in. And this is where you can use your calculator. Okay. So let's go ahead, let's pull my calculator up. And x squared, so 1 squared plus 5 times 1 equals 6. Now, negative 6, I'm going to put it in parentheses, negative 6 squared plus 5 times negative 6 also equals 6. It did work. Now, if I wouldn't have remembered the parentheses, it won't work. Because, again, my calculator is taking 6 and squaring and making it negative. So be careful with those parentheses and squaring. Or I can do it in my head. Negative 6 squared, negative 6 times negative 6 is positive 36, plus the negative 30 is 6. I'm just doing this process in my head. So they both work. So there are my solutions.